we've been working to do.
Well, on this big news day, let's bring in our socially distanced political panel, and I'm joined in the studio by New South Wales Labor MP Meryl Swanson. Thanks for your time. And West Australian Liberal MP Celia Hammond. Welcome to you both. Celia Hammond, just starting with you, the message from the United Nations, a code red for humanity, basically global efforts aren't yet working. How do you respond to such dramatic language?
It is dramatic language, and I think that the IPCC report is a really good wake-up call. A further wake-up call for all of us. There's also positives in there. It's not too late. And Australia is committed, this government has committed to our 2030 targets. And as the Prime Minister has explained on numerous occasions, we are looking at 2050. We're aiming for net zero as soon as possible, preferably before 2050, and we will be putting out a new plan ahead of Glasgow later this year. So a new plan, a new national strategy towards climate emissions.
Given the PM has been really inching towards this, obviously it was last year when he first talked about getting to 2050 as soon as possible. Do you think we are going to end up committing to that 2050 target of net zero emissions?
I of course think that we will. Yes, I do. I think that we will. I think it makes economic sense. I think it makes environmental sense. And all of those factors are combined together. It makes sense for us as a country. It makes sense for the world.
Okay, well, Meryl Swanson, Labor has already committed to 2050. 2030, though, that's still up for debate within the party. At the last election, you took a emissions reduction target of 45% by 2030. That was seen as too ambitious, but given what we're reading today, do you think it is still too ambitious?
Jane, I just firstly want to acknowledge Celia's comments today in saying it's a wake-up call, and she does believe that the government will eventually get to net zero by 2050. I think that that's great and it should be acknowledged. In terms of where we're headed, I think after a report like we've heard today, we need not be focusing on what Labor's short or medium-term targets are. We know, like every other business, a major business in the country, we are working towards that set target. Now, I welcome the comments that Celia has made in hoping that the Prime Minister is going to find some bipartisanship on this with us. We need, honestly, now, after a report like this that says the world is burning without being too dramatic about it, we need bipartisanship. The government has got to meet us on this. The country expects us to do more than we have been doing. With all respect, they've had 8 years. The Prime Minister said everyone to be vaccinated by Easter, just sort of saying we're going to get
we'll
there.
We'll get to the vaccine targets later on, but let's stick with climate change for now.
It's a comparable conversation.
Sure.
You know, how can we trust that? People want more done, and they also want their jobs protected, and that's where the investment certainty comes in.
Can I just pick up on something that Meryl said there? We have been doing things, and I think that needs to be emphasised as well. Yes, I believe we'll make a statement of net zero by 2050, but let's not dismiss the fact that we have actually been undertaking significant steps. We've committed to $20 billion in renewable technologies, in investment up until 2030. We've reduced 20% on 2005 levels. This government has been acting, but I do agree with Meryl and I do agree with others, a bit of bipartisanship and a longer term goal heading towards 2050 to back in what we've already committed to and what we're already doing. People want some clarity on this. I think people also want to move on from the days of the climate wars. Let's just all move on to this. Let's acknowledge what's been done. We've done a lot. We're still doing a lot. Now let's just all get on the same page going forward.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the climate wars because you entered Parliament sort of after, I suppose, the perhaps worst of it. Are you surprised? I mean, realistically, the biggest challenge here is the coalition party room because there are particularly Nationals members who have made it very, very clear that they are not at all in favour of a 2050 target. Coming from the university background that you do, where you are talking about science and evidence-based decisions, were you surprised that the level of sort of politicisation of climate change when you entered Parliament?
I think the politicisation of climate change has been going on for at least the last 10
years. But it's very
as you've
specific to
just pointed out.
Australia, because you look at comparable countries like UK, for example, and it's just not a political issue there.
Oh, look, I think that there's discussion and debate. If you actually spend time in any of the of large countries and you look into their political discourse, there is debate. What I would say is about my party and the coalition is that there are a range of views, but for those people who are still hesitant about setting a 2050 target, their main issue is that they want a plan. They want a clear strategy and plan set out as to how we're going to do that. I want that too. And I think we're heading in that direction. We are going in that direction. So I think the hesitancy, as I see it with some of my colleagues, it is about having a definitive plan, not just coming up with a target without saying how you're going to get there. That, from an evidence-based, approach, is useless as well, to have a target without saying how you're going to get there. So their views have got to be looked at in that context.
Okay, I want to talk about the resources industry. West Australia, obviously, big resource-rich state, but coal particularly. Meryl Swanson, you represent a coal mining community. The UN has said this report must sound a death knell for coal and fossil fuels before they destroy our planet. How do you kind of weigh this now? I mean, the UN is effectively saying we are heading towards an existential crisis. So given these kind of warnings and given what you've said, do we need to be speeding up the transition away from coal to cleaner technologies?
It's so interesting, Jane, because the coal that we export from my part of the world and the people that work in those jobs in the Hunter, it's the world's best. And there are still so many emerging nations that rely on coal from the Hunter. In fact, Japan, the world's 5th largest economy, is running on Hunter coal because after Fukushima, it lost its nuclear reactors. So they are still dependent on us. And not only for coal for energy, but coal for steel making. So it's so important. I absolutely understand what the panel is saying, and we know that we have to embrace renewables. But part of getting to where we want to be as a planet is assisting those nations, particularly to our north. You know, we've got people who are still burning dung to cook meals and for energy on the planet. Our coal is assisting many of those countries who are making their way to renewables to get there. We owe it to them to sell our coal to them, to help them get there quicker. And I know that sort of sounds like a contradictory statement, but it's so important that we do our bit. And by producing the world's best coal, and if we had some decent policy from the government on how we could get there quicker from our position in Australia, we would be doing them even more favours. So
how do you mean that? Do you mean in terms of transitioning our own energy market?
I mean in terms of, we've had a government in power for 8 years. And I respect Celia saying, you know, people don't just want to jump into a target, they want a plan to get there. But surely 8 years, 8 long years, you've got some really smart people in your party, as do I. Surely with help of government departments, you could have had a plan done by now. Why hasn't it been done? Under a Labor government, we will have a plan. We will show Australians how to get there using coal, using renewables, how we can make our planet better and how we can contribute. And just very quickly, Jane, we have done well. Australia's reduced its emissions intensity by 64% since 1990. That should be applauded, and I think that is a good thing.
But isn't this one of the big problems, though? So the Prime Minister today was talking about developing countries needing to do more, but precisely as you said, we are shipping our coal to those developing countries who are then burning that coal, and that's increasing global emissions. So don't coal exports, isn't that kind of the elephant in the room here? Shouldn't we be talking about that?
As Meryl said, our coal is one of the cleanest in the world, and so it's better that they take the coal from us. We also need to get those developing countries, if we create a two-stage, if we stop the coal going to these countries, they will not be able to develop at the pace that we need them to, that they want to, that we all want them to.
And that is coal the point and prosperity have gone hand in hand for much of the 20th century.
But this is also the key thing about our technology roadmap and our investment in technology, is that if we in Australia, where we've got the capacity, where we've got the smart people, if we get technology developed, we can then export that to those countries as well. So as opposed to the developing countries spending as long a time as perhaps all of the developed countries have in a reliance on coal, their period of reliance on coal will be lessened by the technologies that we and other countries will develop and will be able to export to them.
And that's why we need some really good policy settings from the government. We've got to have those, Celia. I mean, we would welcome that. And I do think it's important that we start to seriously talk about some bipartisanship. Australians are over it. They want good jobs. You know, we want to be able to export our renewables as well, you know, green hydrogen, all of the exciting developments that are coming that will create jobs. That's really exciting. But we need some policy, and business, I think it's fair to say, is yearning for that policy certainty.
Well, business is effectively leading the way.
They're doing it themselves, you're right,
groups,
Jane.
We've got miners who are all setting 2050 ambitions, so you would hope the government might lead on this.
And businesses are, and Twiggy Forrest with his green steel, absolutely phenomenal. But in many endeavours that we as a world have undertaken, businesses have led the way. So whenever anybody says that in this context, it's just, yeah, and that's great. It's not a thing to be ashamed about. Our businesses have led the way in all forms of technology.
But where could we be if the government held their hand?
Our digital technology at the moment is not owned by any government. You know, it was developed by Steve Jobs, and so businesses leading the way. It's a good thing. That's a sign of our creativity and our world at work.
Okay, well, Meryl, I just wanted to pick you up on one point, because we're just talking about the coalition and the Nationals potentially being the problem with the ambition in terms of that party room. The left of Labor obviously wants a more ambitious policy, and coming up to an election, we know that in many sort of inner city seats that it's often Labor versus the Greens, and the Greens have a much more ambitious climate policy. And in fact, the Greens leader, Adam Bant, has just said in a press conference that Labor is giving cover to the Prime Minister because Labor's not being more ambitious. What do you think about that argument? Like, that is a very hard, I suppose, balance for the Labor Party to strike.
Look, I think that, we have time and time again said that we do not want to follow the Greens down their pathway. We have our own path, and that we've got the sensible path where we're balancing jobs that exist right now and jobs that we know can be created in the future. And I've got some fantastic colleagues that hold those inner city seats, and I know that they can have meaningful conversations with their constituency to say, look, this is how we want to do it. We don't need to trash every job in the coal industry or in our heavy manufacturing or transport industries to get to where we want to go. And I know that my colleagues will work hard to have those conversations, as do I with my constituents who are also worried about their jobs. So this is one of these things where we're in a time of enormous change and uncertainty. So it's up to the smart people in the room to be showing leadership, having conversations with people and saying, look, we can't jump from here to there in one go, but we're going to get there over time with sensible policies and ideas.
So when people in your electorate whose jobs rely on the coal industry, what do they think when they see a report like this today that says, this is a code word for humanity, that this signals the death knell for coal and fossil fuels? Do people in the coal community think, okay, well, maybe, I need to start looking at another job? Or does this just send down their spine?
No, I'll tell you what they think. They think, look, okay, they get it. They understand what this report is saying, but they also go to work every day and they know about the forward orders for their mine, and they know that they've got commitments. Many of the companies have got arrangements with Japan and other countries, for years out. They've made those agreements. So they know what's expected and they know that their jobs are secure. So what is happening here? But they also know that, yes, days are coming, into the future where there will be changes. What they want is to keep their good jobs now, and they want their kids trained well. They want opportunities in the future, whether they're in the coal industry, whether they're in renewables, whether it's in space or defence or all of the incredible technologies that are coming down the line to us. They want their children well educated and prepared, and they want opportunity for our regions as well as the cities.
All right, Celia Hammond, just before we have to let you guys go to get to question time, pretty much similar question to you. West Australia being a big LNG producer, also a high emitting industry. I'm just sort of wondering where the sort of ambition on climate change sits with jobs, because that's always been the kind of a hard, I suppose, tussle for any government.
Yeah, I think the same position. I'd make the same comments that Meryl made. It is transition, and it's not that anybody's talking about switching off the coal industry tomorrow. And all of these people not having a job. Likewise in gas. Gas is a transition fuel. We've actually outlined that gas is part of our transition to fully renewable. So there's all sorts of opportunities here. It's that planning and it's that strategy moving forward. And I think that we're doing that.
All right, Celia Hammond, Meryl Swanson, thanks for your time. I'd hoped we get to a whole bunch of other issues, but climate change being the issue of the day. But thank you.
Thanks,
Jane.